The North Atlantic in 1943 was a place where survival often depended on imagination as much as steel. Beneath its black, freezing waves, German U-boats prowled in deadly silence, hunted relentlessly by Allied destroyers armed with radar, sonar, and depth charges. The ocean had become a chessboard of death. One mistake meant obliteration. In late spring of that year, one of those submarines, U-312, found itself trapped in a nightmare. The boat, a Type 68, had been operating north of Iceland, part of a dwindling wolf pack scattered by improved Allied air patrols. Its commander, Captain Lieutenant Erich Wolf, was an experienced officer, cautious, disciplined, the kind who trusted procedure. But what saved U-312 that night was not procedure. It was an idea born from desperation, suggested by a young sailor whose plan sounded almost ridiculous. That morning, before the disaster began, the crew had been on the surface, recharging batteries under gray skies. The North Atlantic was a vast sheet of rolling steel, broken only by sleet and wind. Then came the sound, distant, rhythmic, unmistakable, the screws of an enemy destroyer. The order to dive came instantly, the deck washed in foaming water as the U-boat slipped beneath the surface. At 60 meters depth, the engines went silent. The electric motors hummed softly as the crew listened through the hydrophones. What they heard chilled them. Multiple ships, circling, hunting. The convoy's escort had picked up something on sonar, a faint contact, maybe their own echo, maybe U-312. Either way, the hunt had begun. For hours, the destroyers combed the area, sweeping with sonar, dropping depth charges in widening arcs. The blasts thundered through the hull, shaking bolts loose, slamming men against bulkheads. The lights flickered, gauges quivered. The U-boat crept deeper, 120 meters, 140, 160, until the hull groaned like a living thing. The men held their breath with every explosion, waiting for the sound of cracking metal. One charge detonated so close that the aft torpedo room flooded briefly before the watertight door sealed. The air grew thick with oil and sweat. Carbon dioxide levels climbed. Even the captain, calm to the core, began to realize that the destroyers were not giving up. They were trapped. Every time U-312 moved, the sonar caught the sound. Every time it stopped, the destroyers circled tighter, guessing the depth, adjusting their fuses. The commander ordered silence, then ordered movement, then silence again. Nothing worked. The crew began to whisper that they would never surface again. And then, amid the dread, a petty officer, an engine mechanic named Carl Fischer, made a strange suggestion. Fischer was not an officer or a tactician. He was a man of machines, grease, and noise. His idea, when he muttered it to his comrades in the control room, seemed absurd. But in that hopeless moment, absurdity was all they had left. He proposed using one of the submarine's ballast tanks, normally filled with seawater to control buoyancy, not for diving or surfacing, but as a decoy. If they could release a large volume of oil, air, and debris at once, it might look to the enemy as if the U-boat had been destroyed. The ocean would erupt with bubbles and slicks, the kind of signature a destroyer's crew would interpret as the death of their target. The plan sounded foolish. It meant sacrificing valuable oil, potentially destabilizing the submarine, and risking the release of sound that could betray their position further. But Fischer insisted the mixture could be tuned to mimic an implosion, a false grave for U-312. At first, the commander hesitated, but then another depth charge detonated directly above the conning tower, tearing loose panels and killing one crewman instantly. The lights went out. In the darkness, dripping water and hissing air filled the silence. When power returned on the emergency circuit, Wolf gave a single nod. There was nothing else left to try. The order was given. Prepare the aft ballast tank for release. The men worked in near darkness, hands slick with oil, nerves frayed by the pressure groaning around them. They poured in oil from damaged reserves, mixed in debris from the bilge, bits of rubber, canvas, broken wood. Fischer adjusted valves by instinct, listening to the rhythm of the pumps. Above them, the destroyers continued to circle. The sonar pings grew louder, closer, like the heartbeat of a predator about to strike. The next volley of depth charges was already being prepared. Carl Fisher leaned against the cold steel bulkhead, watching the needle on the pressure gauge tremble. When it hit the right mark, he pulled the lever. A deep hiss echoed through the submarine, followed by a long, rising rumble as the false plume began to rise toward the surface. No one in the crew breathed. The fate of every man aboard now depended on whether the enemy believed in their destruction. The mixture left the submarine's hull in a violent burst, vanishing upward through the black water like a cloud of blood. The pressure outside pressed every bubble and droplet into a perfect illusion, an eruption of oil, air, and debris spreading fast toward the surface. Inside the submarine, every man felt the sudden shift in trim as U-312 lurched slightly upward, its ballast uneven. For a moment, the boat hung in the water, fragile as a leaf, before stabilizing at 170 meters. Above them, the ocean trembled. The first depth charges had already been launched, time for the usual descent rate of a hunted submarine. But this time, they exploded far above, muffled and distant. The echoes rolled through the hull like thunder in a faraway storm. Then came something stranger. Silence. No new charges, no active sonar pings, no propeller churn. Just a long, uncertain stillness that seemed to stretch forever. The men listened to the hydrophone operator's trembling voice. Through the static of the deep, faint new sounds emerged. The roar of a massive explosion near the surface, followed by a chorus of human voices and mechanical clatter. The destroyer crews were shouting, reacting. Then one unmistakable phrase in English filtered faintly through the din. Oil! Wreckage! The illusion had worked. Above, the Allied destroyers watched as the surface erupted with slick black oil and pieces of debris. A slick nearly 50 meters wide spread across the waves, glinting in the weak light. Wooden splinters, rags, and metal shards floated upward. The contents of U-312's bilge and storage compartments now convincing proof of its demise. Through binoculars, it looked exactly like the aftermath of a kill. One of the destroyers even circled the spot, dropping a few token depth charges into the center. Not as an attack, but as a celebration, ensuring the submarine wreck sank deeper. Below, in the dark silence, the men could only wait. The submarine was stable again. Engines dead, crew whispering prayers in the stale air. The hull groaned as the depth stabilized. Fisher leaned against a bulkhead, his face ghostly pale in the dim red light. His plan, the ridiculous plan, had fooled the enemy. Hours passed. The destroyer's noises grew faint, then distant. One by one, their propeller sounds vanished into the murk, swallowed by the vast Atlantic silence. By late afternoon, only the faint hiss of the ocean currents remained. Inside the U-boat, relief mixed with disbelief. The commander paced slowly through the control room, checking gauges, pressure valves, and the oxygen meter. The carbon dioxide levels were dangerously high now. They had been submerged for nearly 18 hours. Men's lips had turned pale blue. Condensation dripped from every surface. But no one dared rise yet. Fisher sat with his back to the bulkhead, staring at his oil-streaked hands. Around him, men murmured prayers or stared blankly ahead. In those moments of quiet, time lost meaning. The only light came from the instrument panel. Dim green and red reflections dancing across faces streaked with exhaustion. At 1900 hours, the hydrophone operator reported nothing. No engines, no pings, no patrol craft. The destroyers were gone. The commander finally gave the order to surface. Slowly, the ballast tanks were blown with compressed air, sending a trail of bubbles toward the surface. The submarine rose painfully, groaning as pressure eased. After nearly 20 hours submerged, U-312 broke through the waves under a dark sky streaked with sleet. The crew stumbled onto the bridge, gasping for clean air. The wind whipped across their faces, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of salt and oil. The surface was calm now. Only the fading sheen of the fake oil slick remained, glistening in the moonlight. No ships, no aircraft, nothing but the endless horizon. U-312 had outlived the hunt. The commander turned toward Fisher, who stood by the hatch, still streaked with grime, his expression unreadable. The sailor had not spoken since the release, but around him the men looked at him differently now, with something close to reverence. As the submarine's engines rumbled back to life, The Atlantic swallowed the last of the oil slick. The illusion had not only fooled the enemy, it had erased the submarine's existence entirely from their reports. To the Allied fleet, U-312 was gone. To the ocean, it had simply become one more ghost in the deep. Night air bit like a blade, but it tasted of life. The crew worked by habit and moonlight, clearing the conning tower scuppers, pumping the bilges, and rigging a jury panel over split plating aft. Batteries drank current from the diesels with a hungry whine. Compressors hammered, rebuilding the precious cushion of air that kept valves honest and men conscious. After 20 hours down, every switch sounded like a heartbeat. The dead were recorded in the log, the wounded wrapped in blankets near the warm bulkheads. No signals were sent. The ether in 1943 was a battlefield as lethal as the sea, and HF/DF stations could pull a transmission from the wind and nail it to a grid square. U-312 slid west at economical speed, deck awash, black against black water. Somewhere beyond the curve of the horizon, the Allied convoy lanes pulsed with traffic and protection. Centimetric radar on patrol aircraft. Lee lights that split night wide open, escorts fitted with Hedgehog ahead throwers, and sonar skilled enough to read a wake. The U-boat's old METOX detector was nearly useless now. The enemy's new wavelengths slipped past it like knives. Survival meant shadow and silence. Damage reports crawled in. A buckled frame near the stern planes. A weeping gland on a high-pressure line. A ballast gauge pinned and lying. The aft ballast tank, the stage for Fisher's deception, had lost oil and took on a slow seep through its inspection cover. Chief machinists tightened, packed, and prayed. The boat could dive, but every meter would ask questions of the steel. Before midnight, weather turned. Sleet hardened to pellets and the wind veered north, flattening the sea to an iron sheet that carried sound for miles. It should have favored the hunted. Instead, the surprise came from above. A sudden whisper of air, then a hard white disk opened in the clouds. The merciless eye of a Lee light. Water blew apart on the bridge. The diesels roared. The watch tumbled below, and U-312 slid under in a welter of foam as Tracer stitched the surface where men had stood seconds before. Depth took the light away, but not the danger. Sonar pings began almost at once, bright, regular, and close. The enemy had ridden the radar contact straight to the dive point. The first stick of depth charges marched down the slope of the thermocline and broke on the hull with hammer blows. Dust leapt from cable runs. A man coughed blood and held his teeth in his mouth. The needle of the depth gauge edged past 120 meters. Now the ocean spoke in old, hard ways. Hedgehog bombs rattled forward, contact fused, searching for steel instead of pressure. The hydrophone watch called bearings with a knuckle wrap code. The helmsman eased the boat along a slow spiral to keep the screws from singing. Bold canisters, the standard German chemical bubble decoys, were fired in pairs, puffing chalky caverns in the water to bloom on the enemy's sonar. For a minute, the pings wandered. Then they found U-312 again. The escorts had learned to bracket bold and listen through the noise. Fisher moved through the cramped belly of the boat with the calm of a man who knows only machines. His first trick had bought daylight. This night demanded something harsher. He studied the damaged gauges, the breathing of the pumps, the ache of steel at depth, and began to sketch an impossible sequence in grease on a bulkhead. A hard rudder, a brief, savage burst of compressed air into the wounded aft tank, a synchronized dump of scrap and oil through the external vent, and an immediate silent drop into the cold layer below, an artificial break-up signature married to a vanishing act. Above, screws crossed like scissors. A second string of charges tumbled. The boat shuddered and steadied, lights dimming to blood red. The commander's hand rested on the crash levers. The crew waited at stations they could man blind. The Atlantic held its breath with them. The next explosion came so close it felt like the ocean itself struck back. A violent shock wave rippled through the hull, bursting gauges and extinguishing half the lights. For a few seconds, the submarine was plunged into a dark red gloom, filled with drifting dust and the groans of strained steel. Somewhere aft, a pipe burst, spraying a mist of oily water into the air. The U-boat was still alive, but barely. At 180 meters, they were near the edge of what the Type IIC could survive. Any deeper and the pressure would crush the hull like paper. The men knew it. Every creak sounded like the beginning of death. The commander gave a quick order, and the helmsmen steadied their descent. The boat held, trembling. Outside, the sonar pings continued. Measured, patient, deadly. Fisher worked his way aft, flashlight beam cutting through the dim air. He could smell the burnt insulation and oil, hear the hiss of leaking air from damaged seals. He reached the auxiliary manifold where his improvised decoy system had been jury-rigged earlier. It wasn't built to be used twice. The pipes groaned, the valves already weakened by pressure. Still, it was their only chance. His plan was dangerous, absurd even by the standards of submarine warfare. The first trick had faked a kill near the surface. Oil, air, and debris. This second one aimed to mimic destruction in the deep. If he could make the destroyers think the submarine had imploded under pressure, they might call off the attack entirely. But the illusion had to be convincing. The sound, the bubbles, even the heat signature of a breaking hull. Fisher rerouted compressed air through a cracked reserve line, feeding it into the damaged aft tank. Then he mixed what remained of the waste oil with seawater, adding loose bolts and fragments scavenged from the bilge. It was crude alchemy, turning desperation into theater. The trick was timing. If they released the mixture while the destroyer's sonar was strongest, the sudden acoustic bloom might appear as a catastrophic collapse. The commander crouched beside him, listening as another series of pings echoed through the hull. The rhythm was closing in, one destroyer directly above, another sweeping in from starboard. The charges were coming again. The crew braced for impact. The explosions fell in perfect sequence, hammering closer, until one struck just off the stern. The submarine pitched forward violently. Men were thrown against bulkheads. A wrench clattered across the deck. Fisher's hand flew to the valve. He turned it full open. Instantly, the aft tank erupted. A torrent of bubbles and oil shot upward, blasting through the sea like a plume from a dying beast. Inside, the pressure drop sent the boat lurching. Gauges spun. The hull boomed as air forced its way through ruptured seams. For a moment, everyone thought it was the end, but the submarine held together. Then came the silence, the strange, heavy quiet that follows violence. The sonar pings faded. No new charges fell. Through the hydrophones came only the faint, confused chatter of allied voices. Fisher looked up, sweat and oil running down his face. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before when a ship confirmed a kill. The destroyers were talking to each other, reporting the destruction of a submarine. Somewhere above, someone had seen the massive oil plume break the surface, black and wide, exactly like an implosion's aftermath. Inside U-312, men began to realize they were still alive. The commander ordered all engines off. Absolute silence. The submarine drifted downward slowly, settling just above the silt at 200 meters. No one moved. They waited hour after hour, listening. Above, the destroyers circled once, twice, and then slowly pulled away. The pings grew faint, then disappeared completely into the watery distance. The enemy believed the U-boat was gone. Fisher leaned against the bulkhead, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Around him, men stared in disbelief. His second ridiculous plan had worked. They had tricked death itself twice in one day. The commander walked forward to the control room, where condensation dripped from the ceiling like rain. The smell of oil and ozone filled the air. He looked at the depth gauge, steady at 200 meters, and finally allowed himself to breathe. The ocean was still, vast and black. The destroyers were gone. But now came a new danger. The U-boat was crippled, nearly out of air, and trapped at crushing depth. If they tried to surface too quickly, the hull might not survive. In the silence of the deep, the crew began to understand the next challenge. Escaping the hunters was only the beginning. The harder part would be surviving the ocean itself. At 200 meters below the North Atlantic, light ceased to exist. U-312 floated in a twilight of red dials and dim emergency lamps, surrounded by pressure so immense that the hull seemed to groan with every breath the crew took. Water seeped through hairline cracks and gathered in trembling pools on the deck plates. The air was heavy with oil, carbon dioxide, and silence. For the first time in 12 hours, no sonar pings echoed through the hull. The enemy had vanished into the distance, convinced the submarine lay shattered on the seafloor. But victory meant little at that depth. The crew's lungs burned from stale air, and oxygen was dwindling fast. The chemical scrubbers could do little more. Every man felt the weight of the ocean pressing into his skull. Fisher sat slumped beside the manifold that had nearly killed them all. His hands were blistered, his uniform soaked with oil, but his mind refused rest. He watched the depth gauge needle tremble between 195 and 200 meters, knowing that any sudden rise in pressure or temperature could split the hull apart. Above him, drops of condensation fell rhythmically from the curved ceiling, a slow metronome of survival. The commander checked his watch, 18 hours since they had last surfaced. He walked the narrow passage between control stations, whispering to the engineer to reduce power draw even further. Every ampere counted. The batteries were near exhaustion. They could not risk running the motors to ascend yet. Any vibration might give them away if the destroyers lingered within sonar range. The silence was deceptive. Even a whisper carried through the metal skin of the U-boat like thunder. The men knew it and moved with exaggerated care, closing hatches by hand, breathing shallowly, avoiding every clang and scrape. The ocean outside was alive with sound. Distant wails, shifting thermals, the faint hum of distant propellers, but none close enough to threaten. Still, every ear strained for the return of that dreaded ping. Minutes turned to hours. The air thickened until breathing felt like swallowing water. One man fainted near the radio compartment. Another began to cough uncontrollably, blood flecking his lips. The medic, a thin youth, barely 20, wrapped a damp rag over his own mouth and tended to them quietly. No one spoke. In that suffocating stillness, the commander made his decision. They could not stay down any longer. The batteries were almost drained, and the air was poisonous. If they were to die, it would be on the surface, not slowly, not suffocating in silence. At 3:40, the order came in a whisper that carried like thunder through the boat. The helmsman adjusted ballast controls and compressed air hissed softly into the main tanks. The U-boat stirred. Slowly, painfully, it began to rise. Every meter upward reduced the crushing weight, but every meter also increased the risk that the sound of shifting water would betray them. The climb took nearly an hour. The pressure creaked and popped through the hull like the groans of an old shipwreck coming back to life. Fisher stood near the aft controls, eyes fixed on the gauge. At 120 meters, a faint ping echoed, a single, distant note that froze every man in place. The destroyers were still out there, miles away, but searching again. The commander motioned to stop the ascent. The submarine held steady at 118 meters, floating between life and death. The ping came again, fainter this time, then vanished. They waited. 5 minutes, 10, 20, nothing. Cautiously, the ascent resumed. At 80 meters, the water grew warmer, the current stronger. The men began to sense the shift in air, the faint promise of oxygen, the illusion of freedom. At 50 meters, the commander allowed the electric motors a whisper of power, just enough to angle toward the surface current. Finally, at 4:52, the pressure gauge steadied. U-312 broke the surface. The hatch burst open, and cold night air rushed in, burning their lungs like fire. Men gasped, laughed, or simply collapsed. The sky above was cloudless, silver under the moon. No ships, no aircraft, nothing but the endless black plain of the Atlantic. They were alive. The commander climbed to the bridge and scanned the horizon through binoculars. In the distance, faint flashes lit the horizon. The convoy still moving east, unaware the ghost of U-312 had returned to the living. Below deck, Fisher leaned against a bulkhead, staring at his oil-stained hands. The ridiculous improvised tricks that should have failed had saved them twice. Yet he felt no triumph, only a bone-deep exhaustion that no air could cure. The engines coughed to life again. U-312 turned west, crawling toward the dark shelter of the mid-ocean gap, leaving behind only the silent proof of its survival. A swirl of oil, bubbles, and wreckage drifting on the waves, waiting to fool the next searchlight that passed. The Atlantic closed over the site of its own deception once more. Dawn came pale and hollow, spilling thin light across the endless gray Atlantic. The ocean was calm now, deceptive in its serenity. For U-312, calm seas meant visibility, danger from the sky. The submarine moved on the surface at reduced speed, diesels coughing softly, exhaust plumes barely visible in the cold air. Every man aboard knew that survival after surfacing was not victory. It was only another chance to die. The crew worked in silence, their faces drawn and hollow from lack of sleep. The first priority was repairs. Water had seeped into the aft compartments during the last depth charge run, soaking wiring and corroding switches. Fisher led the work party, hands trembling from fatigue, as he tightened bolts and sealed leaks with makeshift gaskets cut from torn rubber boots. The men followed his instructions without question now. His improvised genius had twice saved their lives. On this boat, that made him more than an engineer. It made him a talisman. The diesel hum was the only sound besides the wind. Above, the horizon stretched empty, unbroken by masts or contrails. Still, they knew the Allied patrols never slept. Radar could find a periscope, a snorkel, even the ripple of a wake. The commander kept the boat zigzagging, altering course every 15 minutes to stay unpredictable. In the radio compartment, the operator sat before a battered set of dials. He wasn't sending messages. That would be suicide. Instead, he listened to faint Allied transmissions, to coded weather reports, to anything that might tell them where the hunters were. Intermittent signals drifted through the static. Convoy coordinates, aircraft patrol zones, warnings about unconfirmed submarine contacts. One message mentioned an oil slick north of their position, believed to mark the destruction of a U-boat. The crew listened in silence. The illusion had become an official report. The Allies had declared U-312 destroyed. That knowledge settled over the men like a strange blessing. To the world, they no longer existed. No aircraft would hunt them specifically. No destroyer would search their wake. They had become a ghost. But ghosts, Kramer knew, could not linger too long. They still needed to cross hundreds of miles of ocean before safety, to reach the supply rendezvous planned near the Azores. By mid-morning, the weather turned. A thick mist rolled in from the northwest, covering the sea in shifting white veils. To most sailors, fog meant peril. To a submarine, it was sanctuary. The commander ordered full surface running under fog cover to recharge the nearly dead batteries. Diesel fumes and cold air filled the hull. The men, exhausted, slumped against bulkheads or fell asleep where they stood. Only Fisher stayed awake, checking pressure gauges and exhaust valves, unwilling to trust anything the ocean touched. The fog thickened until even the conning tower vanished from the deck below. Sound became the only sense that mattered. The distant thump of waves against invisible hulls, the soft hiss of air intakes, the slow heartbeat of the engines. Then, faint and far to the east, came another rhythm. A low, steady drone. Aircraft. Kramer reacted instantly. The alarm bell clanged through the boat. Hatches slammed. The diesels cut off with a violent cough. Men scrambled down ladders as the submarine dove once more beneath the fog. The ballast tanks filled with rushing water, and U-312 slipped into the gray below, just as a Catalina flying boat broke through the mist overhead. Depth 30 meters, then 50. The ocean swallowed the sound of the engines. Only the hum of the electric motors remained. Through the hydrophones, the operator heard the distant drone of the aircraft circling, searching, waiting for radar confirmation, but there was nothing to see. The fog covered the sea, and the water hid the rest. The commander ordered silence. The submarine drifted in near-neutral buoyancy, the only movement the slow dance of currents. For an hour they waited, hearts counting each second. Finally, the sound faded. The aircraft turned west, deceived by the very weather that had once nearly killed them. When they surfaced again, the ocean was still and gray. No aircraft, no destroyers, no radio pings, just mist and cold wind. Kramer leaned on the periscope housing and stared into the endless white void. They had escaped again, not through power, but through chance and cunning. The war, he thought, belonged to those who could turn weakness into invisibility. Fisher joined him on deck a few minutes later, his face blackened with oil, his hands trembling from exhaustion. He looked out over the water, seeing nothing but fog and the faint memory of survival. Somewhere behind them, the convoy steamed east, confident that another U-boat lay broken beneath the waves. They would never know that the ghost they had killed was still moving, quietly, invisibly, beneath their victory. The fog held for 2 days, a pale and endless curtain that concealed everything. Sky, horizon, even time itself. U-312 moved cautiously through it, running on the surface when the mist was thickest and diving when it thinned. The men no longer measured the hours by clocks, but by the rhythm of the watch changes and the rumble of the engines. They existed between worlds, neither dead nor alive, unseen by both friend and enemy. The sea was mercifully calm. Small waves slapped the hull as the submarine glided west at low speed. The batteries were fully charged now, the air purifiers functioning again, but food and morale were running dangerously low. Bread had turned to mold, water tasted of rust, yet no one complained. They had endured worse in the black silence below. Fisher remained busy, as always. He had become the guardian of the submarine's fragile balance, checking pressures, tightening joints, scraping corrosion from fittings. The aft ballast tank, the one that had twice saved them, was nearly ruined now, its seals warped and valves fouled with oil. But he still treated it like a living thing, coaxing it to hold for just a few more days. Each repair was a silent prayer in metal and grease. Kramer spent his time between the periscope and the chart table. Every 6 hours he surfaced briefly to check the sky for stars. Most nights the fog made navigation guesswork, but on the third night the clouds broke for a few minutes, revealing a cold scatter of constellations. By their light, he confirmed what he already feared. They were drifting too far south. The current had carried them off the expected route toward the Azores. Returning north meant crossing open water, the killing zone of Allied patrols. Continuing south meant hunger and risk of fuel exhaustion, but south also meant fewer eyes, fewer aircraft. A decision was made. They would stay in the fog as long as it held, and then use the deep thermals near the mid-Atlantic ridge to travel unseen. The next morning, the fog thinned just enough for the lookout to see the gray shape of floating wreckage ahead. A shattered lifeboat, half submerged, rolling gently in the swells. Painted across its side, barely legible, was an English name, Marlborough Star. The ship had been sunk weeks earlier, its survivors rescued. But to the men of U-312, the sight was unsettling. A reminder of what they were and what hunted them. The ocean devoured everything without judgment. As the day wore on, the diesel engines began to cough. Fisher investigated and found seawater in the fuel filters, likely drawn in during the last violent dive. He spent hours disassembling the intake system, his hands numb from the cold, sweat freezing on his neck. The commander watched from the control room, saying nothing. Everyone knew that if the diesels failed completely, the U-boat would never make it home. By evening, Fisher had the engines running again, barely. The sound was uneven, one cylinder misfiring with each rotation. Still, the boat moved forward. The crew gathered what remained of their rations and shared a thin meal of canned meat and hard biscuits. It was not celebration, only survival. That night, the fog began to lift. Slowly, the gray wall dissolved into open sky. The sea darkened, stars emerging like cold fire. The moonlight revealed a world that felt too big, too empty. The men stared out from the conning tower, their faces pale and expressionless. They were exposed now, a single steel shadow adrift in a sea without mercy. At 0200 hours, the radio operator picked up a faint signal. Allied convoy traffic again, farther north. But mixed with it was another transmission, low frequency and coded. It was German, a supply U-boat, a Milchkuh, transmitting rendezvous coordinates for refueling and resupply. The signal was weak, but real. Hope flickered through the steel belly of U-312. If they could reach that position, they could take on fuel, food, and maybe even repair parts. It meant safety, temporary but tangible. Kramer plotted the coordinates on the chart. It would take them 2 days to reach the rendezvous point. 2 days of open water and risk of discovery. He stared at the map in silence, knowing what the ocean demanded in return for every chance it gave. They would move again at dawn, silent and invisible, toward a meeting that could save them or finish them. In the engine room, Fisher wiped his hands on an oily rag and glanced at the trembling gauges. The submarine's heart still beat, unevenly but alive. Above, the fog thinned to silver mist. The stars reflected off the black sea like scattered glass, and U-312 slid into the darkness once more, chasing the faint signal of survival across the indifferent Atlantic. The Atlantic had turned cruel again. The morning after setting course for the rendezvous, wind rose from the northwest, flattening the sea into streaks of white and steel. Swells crashed against U-312's hull, sending cold spray over the conning tower. The submarine rolled heavily, its worn engines groaning with each tilt. For men who had lived too long in silence, the roar of the open sea was both freedom and punishment. By midday, the storm was full. Waves heaved like living walls, burying the bow and wrenching the railings loose. Every few minutes, the horizon vanished entirely beneath the surge. Inside, bolts rattled and seawater leaked through cracked seams in the aft compartments. Fisher worked with a wrench in one hand and a bucket in the other, trying to keep the flooding under control. The electric pumps struggled, their hum deep and uneven. In the control room, the commander watched the compass spin as the submarine fought to maintain course. They were heading southwest toward the coordinates sent by the supply U-boat, but the storm was dragging them off by the mile. There could be no radio confirmation, only faith in a set of numbers transmitted through static. When night fell, the storm did not break. Lightning flickered across the sky, turning the Black Sea into a landscape of silver flashes and shadows. The crew lashed themselves to railings when on deck, their faces numb from salt and cold. It was madness to stay surfaced, but diving meant risking collapse, the hull already strained from previous attacks. So they endured the storm like a steel raft, half submerged and shuddering. Fisher moved between the compartments, his mind locked on the machinery. The diesels coughed and spat smoke, their filters choked with seawater again. If the engines failed now, the current would take them far from any chance of rescue. He improvised once more, cutting strips from his soaked uniform to pack a leaking joint, using hot exhaust to dry corroded contacts. Every sound of mechanical life kept despair at bay. By dawn, the wind began to ease. The storm drifted east, leaving the sea swollen and gray, but mercifully calm. The crew emerged from the hatches, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. They had survived again, though the U-boat looked more like wreckage than a weapon. Kramer studied the map under the pale morning light. By his reckoning, they were only 50 kilometers from the rendezvous coordinates, an empty patch of ocean where the supply U-boat was supposed to wait at midnight. The plan was simple: surface under darkness, approach silently, refuel and resupply, then vanish before Allied patrols could detect the gathering. All day they moved submerged, conserving power, running on electric motors through the quiet depths. The sonar remained empty. No pings, no propellers, only the heartbeat of the ocean. As night fell, they rose carefully to periscope depth. The sky was overcast again, moon hidden behind thick clouds. Perfect darkness. At 2300 hours, the hydrophone operator heard it, faint but unmistakable. The rhythmic hum of twin diesels, steady and slow. A second submarine, close. The crew exchanged glances in silence. The Milchku had come. U-312 surfaced. The wind was light, the sea smooth. Out of the darkness, another gray shape emerged, massive and slow. The supply submarine, U-461. Her deck lights were covered with blackout hoods, glowing dimly like embers in fog. A coded signal blinked from her conning tower. Short, long, short. The reply came instantly from U-312's lamp. Contact made. The two submarines drifted side by side, ropes thrown across, fuel hoses connected. Diesel flowed between the steel beasts, the smell thick and bitter in the night air. Crates of food, spare parts, and mail were passed hand to hand. For a brief, fragile moment, the war seemed distant. Men laughed quietly, trading cigarettes, exchanging news of home whispered across the gap of black water. Then just as the last crate was lowered, the lookout on U-461 froze. A faint rhythmic thump echoed through the fog. Distant but growing. Propellers. Multiple. Kramer didn't need binoculars to understand. Allied hunter-killers, probably a long-range patrol group, had picked up something. Perhaps a stray radar echo. Perhaps luck. Either way, death was coming again. The commanders of both submarines reacted at once. The hoses were cut, lines released. Diesel spilled into the sea, forming a slick that glowed faintly under the stars. Both vessels dove almost simultaneously, vanishing beneath the surface. The sound of destroyer screws filled the water a minute later. Depth charges followed, cascading down through the black Atlantic like iron rain. U-312 plunged deeper, hull screaming in protest. Above them, explosions rolled like thunder, shaking the ocean. Fisher gripped the manifold, eyes locked on the pressure gauge. The tank that had saved them twice before trembled under strain. The first depth charge hit close enough to feel like the sea itself had torn apart. The shock waves slammed through the hull, extinguishing half the lights and sending tools and bodies tumbling through the narrow passageways. Pipes screamed as pressure surged. Water burst through a seam in the stern compartment, spraying the air with oily mist. Somewhere aft, a man was crushed against a bulkhead before anyone could reach him. U-312 dove instinctively, nose down, ballast flooding faster than gauges could register. Fisher clung to a handrail, shouting silent orders that no one could hear over the thunder. The commander's hand hovered near the depth control lever. The depth gauge spun past 100 meters, 120, 150. The destroyers above were closing the circle. Through the hydrophones came the relentless rhythm of death. Sonar pings, measured and exact, bouncing across the steel skin of the submarine. The Allied ships had caught a trace of the fuel slick left behind during the rendezvous and were zeroing in. They had radar, sonar, and luck. The U-boats had nothing but silence and depth. At 180 meters, the hull of U-312 began to groan, steel bending under the merciless weight of the ocean. Fisher crawled toward the damaged ballast tank, his lungs burning, his hands trembling. The valves that had been patched during the storm were leaking again, jets of seawater cutting through the dim light. He tore strips of canvas from his sleeve and jammed them into the gaps, his fingers bleeding. The pressure in the tank was unstable, a dangerous imbalance that could send the boat spiraling if it ruptured. Another explosion tore through the water above. The shock waves shattered a gauge. Shards of glass cut across the engineer's face. But Fisher barely blinked. His mind was fixed on the one idea that had saved them twice before. Smoke and mirrors beneath the sea. He could trick them again. Not with oil this time, but with sound. He scrambled to the control room and gestured frantically to the commander, who was gripping the periscope column as if it were the last solid thing in the world. Fisher pointed at the decoy launcher, the empty housing that once fired the bold chemical canisters. It was useless now, its mechanisms damaged. But Fisher had another thought. If they could pump air and debris through it at the exact moment of a depth charge impact, the sudden burst of sound and bubbles could mimic the implosion of a submarine breaking apart. The commander hesitated, then nodded once. There were no other options. Fisher sprinted back to the aft compartment, his boots sloshing through rising water. He rerouted an airline from the emergency ballast system, sealing it to the damaged decoy vent with a wrench and sheer will. The pressure gauge trembled, climbing past safe limits. He counted the seconds between depth charge bursts, 10, maybe 12. He timed the release to the rhythm of destruction. The next explosion hit. Fisher threw the valve open. A roar of compressed air tore through the hull, racing up the line and out into the ocean. The submarine lurched sideways, the pressure dropping sharply as a massive bubble cloud burst upward. Through the hydrophones, it sounded exactly like a U-boat imploding. A hollow metallic shriek followed by the deep, collapsing sigh of a hull giving way. The effect was instant. Above them, the pattern of explosions broke apart. The sonar pings vanished, and the destroyers, believing their target destroyed, circled once, then shifted focus eastward, perhaps toward the other submarine, perhaps toward nothing. The ocean, once a cauldron of sound and fury, fell eerily quiet. Inside U-312, the silence was unbearable. Men clung to pipes and handrails, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding. The air was foul with smoke and oil. Fisher slumped to the deck, chest heaving. His plan had worked again, but at a terrible cost. The pressure imbalance had cracked another valve, and water was flooding faster now. The commander ordered the pumps to full power. The electric motor screamed. Slowly the flow began to slow, but the damage was done. They were losing buoyancy. The submarine hung at 210 meters, heavier with every heartbeat. The hull flexed audibly, the steel skin groaning like a dying creature. Fisher, barely conscious, forced himself up and began adjusting ballast manually, venting small bursts of air to keep them from descending further. It was a delicate dance. One mistake, and they would either sink to the bottom or rise too fast and betray themselves. For an hour they hovered in the twilight zone, the lights flickering weakly, the crew barely breathing. No more pings, no more explosions. Just the distant hum of the ocean's heartbeat. When they finally dared to ascend, it was by centimeters at a time. The commander ordered no power, no sound, only slow release of ballast and faith in the engineer's touch. At 150 meters, the hull creaked again, but held. At 100, the water grew lighter, flecks of sunlight filtering through the gloom. At 50, the crew began to believe they might live. When the submarine finally broke the surface, it was dawn again. The sea was calm, the destroyers gone. Only the faint smell of oil and the scattered wreckage of the supply boat's fuel hoses floated nearby. U-312 was alive, but barely. Fisher collapsed in the control room, blood streaking his face. The men gathered around him, silent. He had saved them again with nothing but a handful of air and an impossible idea. The commander looked out through the shattered periscope glass at the still horizon. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the proof of their deception. Bubbles fading into the deep, a false grave for the dead who refused to die. The ocean had swallowed another lie. When the first sunlight of morning cut across the Atlantic, U-312 drifted like a scarred shadow on the empty water. The storm was gone, the hunters vanished, and only the slow rhythm of the waves rocked the battered hull. Smoke seeped from the vents, and a trail of oil shimmered behind her like a signature the ocean refused to erase. Inside, the air was heavy with exhaustion and disbelief. The submarine was alive, but barely. Half the lighting circuits were dead, the forward batteries close to dry, and the pressure hull bore deep indentations where the sea had tried to crush it. A dozen men were wounded, two beyond help. Yet all that mattered was that they still breathed. For the first time in days, no one listened for sonar. The ocean was quiet again. Fisher awoke in the control room, his back against the cold steel, the bandages around his hands soaked through. He felt every vibration in the hull, every faint hum of the engines. Each sound was proof of life. The commander stood near the chart table, eyes fixed on a single line drawn westward, the path toward the Azores. Beyond that lay the Bay of Biscay, and beyond that, home. They had one last reserve of diesel, barely enough for 2 days of cautious travel. The plan was simple: run surface by night, submerge by day, and pray the Allies had already written them off. The radio confirmed it later that morning. A faint English transmission, decoded through static, mentioned a confirmed U-boat kill in the central Atlantic. Debris recovered, oil slick spreading, no survivors. The coordinates matched theirs exactly. To the enemy, U-312 was dead. The crew received the news in silence. It was the strangest kind of victory, to vanish while still alive. They no longer existed on any chart, no longer hunted, no longer real. They were ghosts of a machine slipping west through fog and rain. By the second night, the weather turned merciful again. A thick overcast blotted out the stars, and drizzle softened the sea to glass. The men on watch moved quietly across the deck, scanning the horizon with binoculars that showed nothing but mist. Below, Fisher made final adjustments to the pumps and valves, coaxing the wounded submarine through her last miles. Every system was failing in small, invisible ways. Seals weeping, motors grinding, but she held together. Just before dawn, they sighted the rendezvous light from the U-boat tender off the Azores. A faint red blink on the horizon. A supply vessel under camouflage, anchored in a gray fog bank, waiting for the dead to return. When U-312 drew alongside, the sailors on the tender stared in disbelief. The reports said she had been destroyed days ago. Yet here she was, rising from the ocean like something summoned from legend. Fuel hoses were passed, food and water loaded aboard. Messages were exchanged briefly. No names, no questions. In war, miracles were not explained. They were simply recorded. When the refueling was complete, the commander ordered engines ahead at cruising power. U-312 slipped away again into the mist, heading east toward occupied France. The return voyage was slow but uneventful. No aircraft, no destroyers, only fog and the endless heartbeat of the engines. Each sunrise brought them closer to the continent, and to the end of the mission no one would believe. They reached Lorient 10 days later. The submarine limped into the fortified pens at dawn, hull blackened, conning tower scarred, but flag still flying. Dock workers stopped what they were doing to watch in silence. A boat thought lost had come home. When the hatches opened, the stench of oil and sweat spilled out with the survivors. Fisher was carried off first, his hands ruined from work, his eyes sunken but bright. The commander followed, saluting the harbor officer who stood speechless on the quay. No fanfare, no photographs, only disbelief. U-312 was inspected and found barely seaworthy. Her hull plates were warped, her ballast system crippled. She would never go to sea again. The reports filed later mentioned damage from close depth charge detonations and survival through exceptional technical improvisation. Fisher's name appeared once, buried in a line about mechanical adaptation under duress. The rest was sealed in archives no one would read. Weeks later, the war rolled on. New U-boats left port, new crews sailed, and the Atlantic swallowed more lives. The names of the lost filled pages. The story of U-312 faded into rumor, a submarine that died twice and still returned. On a clear morning that autumn, the wreck of a supply U-boat, U-461, was found by Allied aircraft, torn apart on the seabed. Nearby, they noted a wide patch of old oil still drifting. No one could explain it. The Atlantic forgets quickly. For Fisher and his crew, survival had no glory. They had outwitted machines, men, and the ocean itself, yet remained invisible even in victory. But sometimes invisibility is the only triumph the sea allows. Far out in the mid-Atlantic, where no charts mark graves, the water still hides their deception, the strange, ridiculous trick that fooled the world's mightiest fleet. And as waves pass overhead, they erase the last trace of U-312, the ghost that refused to die. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.